Good afternoon. Good evening. I'm Kevin Seville. I'm the resource manager for Center Hill Lake. One of those guys that fished the Caney a lot too, and appreciate all y'all coming out here to talk to us about the water control manual update. We put a lot of time and effort into this, and we're looking forward to presenting our findings and hearing your thoughts. We're not going to take any direct comments during the presentation, but afterwards you'll have an opportunity to talk to some of the group behind us, the subject matter experts sitting at the table. But before I get started, I want to go over a couple of administrative issues. Y'all probably have found the bathrooms and the emergency exit. We have an AED here on the corner if you need it, and we have a deputy sheriff who's going to be swinging by if we need him. So we've got everything covered. Not for you, it's for us. You liked it? I mean, we thought of everything today. But
must not be good news.
Well, it's always good news when you're talking about the river and what we can do to maintain it and keep it healthy and work with our partners. And so I'm excited about it. It's a start and it's a conversation, and that's what a big part of this is having a conversation. And some of these people that you get to see every day that you talk to really play a big part of it. This is some of the course, subject matter experts. This is what they do. This is their, profession, and they're the best at it. So I've been proud to be a member of the PDT and watch them put together some of this stuff. So Bill Peoples gave me a little bit of an intro before I got started, but I think I covered it all. I want to introduce Mr. Patrick Garner in the planning branch, and Mr. Anthony Rodino, who's in the water management branch. They're going to be your primary guest speakers tonight. And they're going to go through their presentation and talk about their findings. And then at the end of this conclusion, like I said, we can go and have a conversation at the table. Feel free to ask any questions. If you would, I have one ground rule. There's a lot of topics I'm sure you guys want to cover while you're here tonight. Let's keep this topic about the water control manual update. And if there's any other topic you want to talk about, I'm happy, or any of us are happy to have those conversations sidebar. But tonight's about the water control manual update, and I'd really like your help in keeping it that way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. Anthony Rodino, Water Management Section Chief in Nashville District. Appreciate everybody coming in today. As Kevin mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the Water Control Manual update for Center Hill. Won't have to talk too much about that, but I like to start with this slide just to kind of orient everyone in case you're not familiar with the area. We're over here right now. Here's Center Hill Dam. It's one of our 10 projects in the Cumberland River Basin. This is how we kind of manage the water within the Cumberland River watershed. So the Corps of Engineers has 10 multi-purpose reservoirs. Center Hill is one of those storage reservoirs. It's one of our main storage reservoirs in our district, and it controls the water on the lower part of the Caney Fork River. So the Water Control Manual kind of dictates some of those operations, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit as the night goes on. Just for kind of background, it was originally authorized for flood risk management or flood control and hydropower. Since then, we've had a lot of different operation and congressional authorizations that have come out that have kind of added some additional purposes that you see down there: fish and wildlife, recreation, water quality, and water supply. Dam was completed in 1948. We had a lot of work in the past few years. If you've been here for the past decade or so, you'll probably remember a lot of construction. We had some dam safety work. All of that work has been completed. We had some work on the hydropower turbines. There's 3 hydropower turbines at Center Hill. All 3 of those have been updated, and we have new hydropower units now that were just finished within the last few years. So knowing that and knowing this operation and knowing how we kind of look at operations, we wanted to take a fresh look at the system and how we operate Center Hill. So I've mentioned Water Control Manual a few times. Kevin mentioned it as well. So what is a Water Control Manual? So as the Water Management Chief, my job, again, oversee operations of the Cumberland River Basin projects. We do that. Each of our projects has what we call a Water Control Manual. It's basically a guide that we use to operate the reservoir. It tells us a lot of different information that we need to know. It has a lot of historical information on there on past floods, what kind of happened during those events, and then how we operate on a day-to-day basis. So all of that is captured within this document. It is a guide. It has a guide curve, which is basically a depiction on where we want to be in terms of water elevation throughout the year. It talks about how much we will release. It talks about how much we would release in a minimum flow. It talks about how many units we would take on or take off at any given time. That's what we call a ramp rate. We'll talk about a lot of that stuff as we go through this presentation. So all of those things are they were on the table for us to relook at. This manual was last updated in 1998, so it's been 25 years at this point. So it is in need of an update. We wanted to make this an open process, come to the table through this public forum and kind of share a year ago now in May, we had the first public meeting, kind of introduce this topic. And now we've got a little bit more concrete plan and a tentatively selected plan on how to move forward. So we wanted to portray that to you guys as well. So that's why we're here. We're here to share the results of our analysis. So Patrick's going to talk a little bit more on the environmental side of the house and the NEPA process. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more on some of the engineering analysis that went into the NEPA document. You can see right here on the right-hand side, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but this is our tentatively selected plan. This is basically how we intend to move forward. And again, I'll talk about this more as we're going through the next couple slides, but just to kind of flash it up here, again, we're looking at minimum flow, ramp rates, and sluice gate operations. Patrick.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Patrick Garner. I'm a biologist in the planning section, and I'm responsible for the environmental documentation that goes along with this process. So you might have received the notice of availability of the EA. That's the document that our section is responsible for. So NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. It's this country's process by which we document federal actions compliance with various environmental laws, such as the Clean Water Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act. And it fulfills the social, economic, and other requirements of past, present, and future generations of Americans. It is a procedural law. There's no set outcome with NEPA. It doesn't determine what option you pick. It's just a process of documenting and analyzing the effects of a given action. So on the right here is a flow chart of the typical process. The color is a little bit difficult to see that this red square here is proposed action. So an agency comes up with a proposed action. There are some actions where we already know the environmental effects. Maybe it's something that we do regularly. Maybe it's an administrative action where there's no ground disturbance or effect. And those are typically, the documentation for those actions are typically covered under a categorical exclusion or a Cat X. And once we document those, we proceed with the action. There are some actions where we don't know the environmental effects. And so we proceed with an environmental assessment. We go through analyses and modeling with the attempt to determine whether there are significant environmental effects. That term significance is a trigger to create an environmental impact statement if there are significant effects. And if there are no significant effects, we proceed with a finding of no significant impact. The public involvement processes, or the process in general for an environmental assessment is very similar to an environmental impact statement with notices of intent, scoping, different periods of public review, and then a final document. This action, we determined that there are no significant environmental effects, and so our plan is to proceed with a finding of no significant impact. So why NEPA on a water control manual? We do NEPA for any federal action that gets federal funds. A water control manual in particular is focused on changing operations, which is that trigger for environmental effects. There's likely to be some sort of impact as a result of this action, and so we analyze what those effects are. This is a little bit about where we are in this process. So as Anthony said, about a year ago, and for a little over a year ago in May, we had a public scoping meeting. I'm sure some of you attended that. We had a public comment period. We received about 250 comments from the public. We took those comments into consideration. We developed alternatives, analyzed those alternatives, drafted an EA, and now we're here at a second public review where we're asking the public to give us feedback on our tentatively selected plan. After this 30-day public comment period, we'll consider the comments again on our proposed action. We'll make any changes that are necessary. We'll have discussions about what our final action will be, and then we will ultimately develop, our plan is to develop that FONSI, or finding of no significant impact. So throughout the public comment period that was started last May, we received comments from 8 environmental organizations and about 250 members of the public. Those had generally the same sort of focus, questions about striving for state dissolved oxygen standards, continuous minimum flows between 200 and 500 CFS, reducing rates of temperature change, water temperature targets at Stonewall, and then limiting changes in hydropower discharge to 1 unit per hour up or down. Anthony will talk about this a little bit here in a minute, but that has been our operational practice over the last 15 or 20 years, despite the fact that that's not codified in the existing water control. We also received input from hydropower stakeholders, so federal hydropower marketers, local hydropower agencies, and their requests were for an elimination of ramp rates, accelerating ramp rates to 30 or 15 minutes rather than hour increments, using the sluice gates only for flood risk management and not to improve dissolved oxygen. We, prior to the implementation of the auto-venting turbines, we had some practices where we were using the sluice gates to try to boost dissolved oxygen. So that comment is about, with the new infrastructure, perhaps those sluice releases aren't needed. And then comments that any increase in minimum flows therefore increases the rate burden to the hydropower customers. What NEPA hinges on is the purpose and need. The purpose and need is a statement that we develop that serves as sort of the baseline for the development of our alternatives. So this is basically our goals and objectives. The need to update the manual, as Anthony said, is that there have been numerous changes in the project area since 1998. Changes in consumption, we've had updated or rehabilitated structural features in the dam. We've also learned a lot since 1998, so we're seeking to put some of that information that we've learned into the manual for future water managers. We want to communicate mission priorities. We have not been strictly adhering to the water control manual over the last 20 years, which has created some unpredictability. And so we want to make sure that we're communicating with the public and with our stakeholders exactly how we intend to operate the dam. And then we want to provide clear operating instructions for emergency situations to our water managers. The other side of that purpose and need is the purpose statement, and these are measurable targets that we intend to hit with our alternatives. So I'll let you all sort of read these as I talk through them. I won't read them to you, but they have to do with the authorized project purposes that Anthony mentioned previously. So this first, the first sentence at the top, it's important to note, talks about existing infrastructure. This study only considered using what we have. We were not able to talk about infrastructure upgrades or anything that would necessitate construction. This is purely using existing infrastructure to target flood risk management. The next one relates to maintaining a pool level that allows us to meet all of our project purposes. Next is a reference to a 1965 cost allocation report that set our target to demonstrate whether we're meeting our authorized purpose for hydropower. Ramp rates that deal with public safety. And then this next bullet is a reference to what we call, and you'll hear reference to, as wetted perimeter, which is the width of the stream channel that is inundated at any given time. And then this last one is a target to water quality standards. So these are the sort of guide that we use to develop our alternatives. And I'll pass the mic over to Anthony, who'll go a little bit into how we develop and then analyze those.
All right, just one clarification. We're currently still following the water control manual. There's just an enormous amount of flexibility in the current water control manual. So just want to clarify that one point. All right, so long process, like we said, it's been going on for a year. What have we been doing? Well, we've been doing a lot of analysis. We're kind of looking at a lot of different alternatives. So my team and other engineers throughout the district were kind of looking at different options and how we could change operations to better balance the competing project purposes. So what it ended up being is we looked at two different main ideas. One is the minimum flow measures that I mentioned, and the other is that ramp rate. So we ended up with a different array of alternatives. About 21 alternatives is what it kind of boiled down to, just in terms of minimum flow. These minimum flow targets ranged from hourly generation numbers, so basically how often we generated 1 hour of hydropower. So every 5 hours we would generate 1 unit throughout the day, all year long. Or potentially have a continuous minimum flow. Those flows range from 200 to 500 CFS all year round. We looked at some seasonal approaches, looking at different things from a continuous minimum flow for part of the year, a hydropower ramp rate, or sorry, a hydropower discharge for part of the year, combinations of both of them, both a continuous minimum flow from something like an orifice gate, or in addition to a hydropower minimum every so many hours. So those are some things we looked at for the minimum flow measures. The ramp rates, again, we have 3 hydropower units at Center Hill. So looking at should we, could we, what are the impacts of 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit ramp rates in terms of how many units we're bringing online at any given time, and then how frequently. Should we look at 15-minute intervals, 30-minute intervals, 1-hour intervals? How often can we bring these units online and still have a safe situation downstream? These measures, when we were looking through them, we tried to look at different criteria for how we should kind of narrow these down and narrow the focus some. So you can see these 4 categories on the right here. These are the different screening criteria we considered. Acceptability and completeness we'll talk about first. And I know the picture quality is not perfect on this, so I'll talk through a little bit of it. These criterion basically were trying to, like I said, narrow down the alternatives into finding that best path forward. And so looking at the measures you see here, these are a list of the different measures. And you can see like 1 pulse every 48 hours, 1 pulse every 12 hours. This is what this is recognizing here. This is 1 pulse every 5 hours with a 250 CFS continuous minimum flow. And so looking at all these minimum flow scenarios, we use different criteria to basically weed some of these out. The first one here is below conservation pool. So what this said was if that alternative, if that measure dropped the reservoir below the conservation pool, which is a range between 618 and 648 feet. So it's a 30-foot range that we have. If it dropped that into the inactive pool, then it was eliminated from consideration. That's critical because once you get below 618, you're looking at water supply intakes, different things like that. You're losing all your net head for hydropower generation. You're losing a lot of your recreation opportunities. Those types of things are really impacted when water levels get that low. The next category there is below a minimum average annual hydropower generation. Patrick mentioned that. That's that 351,000 megawatt hours. So thinking about that, that's what was described to us when we designed this project and it was built and authorized. It was intended to produce a certain amount of electricity at a minimum, average annual minimum. And so a lot of alternatives had that trigger hit, and those alternatives were eliminated for not meeting that criteria as well. Next one, violates wetted perimeter. So we looked at different studies, we looked at our own analysis, we looked back at historical records. What were conditions like before the dam was built? What were conditions like since the dam was built in terms of if we had that natural inflow and there was no dam there, what would we expect the river to look like naturally? And so thinking about it from that perspective, we were looking at, okay, which of these is basically not putting enough water downstream that we think we're having a condition that would have been worse than it would have been naturally. And so those measures were eliminated for those reasons. And then waitability, again, a little more self-explanatory here, but this was, does the measure provide the opportunity for safe waiting conditions for a reasonable amount of time? And so we were looking at our downstream modeling to show, okay, if we pulsed here, how long until that pulse went down so people could get back in the water until the next pulse happened? If there wasn't enough time to basically safely recreate and wait in that area and have that recreation that we all know and love at Center Hill, then those alternatives were, those measures were eliminated as well. So that's kind of how we went through that. That boiled us down to about 8 potential alternatives. You'll see 9 on here. The first one on here, this is the no action alternative. So it would have been eliminated by some of those criteria, but the no action from a NEPA perspective has to be carried through. This is what we're comparing all of our new alternatives to. No action is basically current condition, what's currently in the water control manual. So that's 1 hydropower unit every 48 hours. So then, when we're looking at those second 2 criteria that I mentioned earlier, that's effectiveness and efficiency. How well are these different alternatives doing the job that we're trying to get them to do, right? So if you're looking at effectiveness and efficiency, there's a lot of numbers on here. I don't expect you guys to be able to read all this. A lot of this information is categorized very well in the environmental assessment. So if you have time, if you have not already done so, please read some of that documentation. It should help explain any questions you have. This is a 1 to 5 rating in terms of how well we thought each one of these alternatives met these different criteria. And so 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. We put some ratings to these to kind of help us, again, narrow down the alternatives into something that we could work with. The ones that we'll focus on here are the ones that are, we'll just say, pale, white, 1, 4, 17, and 23. So again, 1 I mentioned, that's the no action. That's going to be carried forth no matter what. 4 is 1 hydropower unit every 8 hours. 17 is 1 unit every 48 hours with a 250 CFS continuous flow, most likely through the orifice gate. And then 23 is a seasonal alternative that basically has 17 through the June through November period, and then alternative 4 in the December to May period. So it's a combination of 17 and 4. All right, so basically after that was done, we took those 4 alternatives that were left, those light colored rows, and we broke them down even further and tried to do some additional engineering analysis to determine how can we compare these, how best to kind of rack and stack them amongst each other. And so one of the things that we were looking at is environmental analysis recreation. How well are we going to be able to improve the downstream area below Center Hill Dam, right? So again, the picture is very hard to read. I apologize for that. Center Hill Dam is here on the bottom of the screen, and this is the Caney Fork River. As you move down the winding river, you come across Happy Hollow, and then downstream, continue to move forward. What we found that was between alternative 4, which is the 8-hour pulsings of hydropower, and alternative 17, there was a lot of similarities once we got to this white checkered area here. Once we got this far down the river, about 5 miles downstream, everything kind of equalized. So both alternatives were very similar. You could think about a pulse. As that water's moving forward, it's basically spreading itself out, and each time that oscillation happens, it's kind of dulling more and more and more. So as the water's moving downstream, it becomes less and less of a pulse and more kind of spread out over time. So that's what you're seeing here, and that's why the alternatives become very similar, because on a whole, they're discharging and they're meeting about the same requirements in terms of the amount of water that's being put into the river, but they're just doing it in different ways. And so the other thing you can see, once you go down towards the very end of the river, towards Stonewall, where we're meeting with the Cumberland River, definitely still a wash there. Both are meeting any type of minimum flow, wetted perimeter, and both are meeting any type of waitable hours. Obviously, there's not as much recreation in that part in terms of waiting or anything like that, but in terms of doing what needs to be done from a recreation standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. As you move further down the river, those things are kind of washed out and taken care of. In this immediate vicinity of the dam, there is a significant improvement from both alternatives 4 and alternative 17. I'm not going to talk about 23 that much because it's really just a combination of the two. But those two alternatives both showed significant improvement in terms of surface area improved, wetted perimeter, and waitable hours. And so what we're looking at here is the amount that it's being improved, right? So we're seeing that alternative 4 shows some improvement, percent increase, about 25%, about 50% for alternative 17. So definitely a distinction there that's important to make. The other condition that I want to point out is, again, they're both better than the no action alternative. So when we're looking at these, we're comparing it not just against each other, but also compared to the no action. So another way of kind of thinking about this from an environmental standpoint and a recreation standpoint is how is the river going to look downstream with each of these flow regimes kind of happening? And some of this is hard to pick up on the slide, so again, I apologize for that. We have more zoomed in pictures at the back of the room that we can talk through later, more specifically, you guys can get up closer. What we're looking at here is a cross section of a point in the river. So this is very close to the dam itself. So again, this picture is almost illegible, but here is the dam. And this first cross section is just in the immediate downstream part of the dam. So just downstream of where we're releasing the water, this is the cross section. So you think about, we're looking at a slice of the river, and we're trying to look at it from a straight on point of view. How deep is the water at that slice of river? And so what you can see here, hopefully, is this lower part below the dark blue line. This is our no action. So with no action, 1 pulse every 48 hours, we're going to have some water that's going to stay in the river at any given time. Once we go to alternative 4, we kind of see a little bump up from that 1 pulse every 8 hours. Again, this is because in the immediate vicinity of the dam, we're going to have the quickest drop off from that pulse, right? As we put it on, elevation is going to go up. As we push it down, it's going to go down. Alternative 17, that's where you see the biggest discrepancy here. Right in the immediate vicinity of the dam, we have the biggest difference between a pulse and a 250 continuous minimum flow. However, as you start moving down, and this is not very far downstream, it's about a mile downstream, between Long Branch and Lancaster, so we're looking around this area here, this is how the cross-section looks there. And so you can see here, alternative 4, in terms of the depth of water, is getting thicker. So we're seeing more water in those cross-sections from this pulse, just even a mile downstream. Now you can see also, there's still that bar on top, but that's starting to shrink now. The delta between them is starting to shrink. And so again, you could tell better on the pictures in the back of the room, and we can talk through that after the presentation. But that's important to note. As we continue to move further downstream, you're going to see the same thing continue to happen. So Lancaster, a little bit further down, and then Happy Hollow, obviously a little bit further beyond that. You can see how this alternative 4, this 1 pulse every 8 hours, is continuing to kind of grow in the depth. And the bar and the delta between itself and alternative 17 is continuing to shrink. So that's something critical. I see your guys' hands. I'm not trying to ignore you, but
We just use the word pulse a lot. Can you just define pulse?
sure, absolutely. So a hydropower pulse, when I say hydropower pulse, it's basically turning the unit on for 1 hour and then turning it off at the end of that hour. So a pulse release is something that is going to be on and off, kind of similar to how we're doing things now. You're going to see a big slug of water happen for an hour coming out of the dam, and then that water is going to stop immediately after we stop discharging. Hydropower turbine is all kind of under the water, so you don't see that cascade that you would see from the Tainer gates coming from the top of the dam, or the violent sluice action that you see when it comes off the flip bucket. But also all this water is kind of being pushed into the tail race underneath the surface of the water. But that's what that pulse means. I'm sorry, thank you for asking.
At what point in the pulse are you measuring these?
So this is the peak.
This is the peak.
The peak, yes. Good question as well. All right. So this is the highest that we would see or the lowest that we would see from those different alternatives. All right, so we looked at the environmental standpoint, we looked at the recreation standpoint, thinking now of the other project purposes we have a hydropower project purpose as well. So I mentioned how we are going to typically do operations, how we're going to release water. The no action alternative here, that's typically the average annual hydropower that we produce in a given year. That is a modeled number based upon perfect conditions. As you guys know, even in your real life, we don't typically have perfect conditions. We have unit outages. We have different maintenance that needs to come offline. We have different criteria, different water quality criteria that kind of restricts us at different times of the year and things like that. So that's an optimal kind of case scenario. Alternative 4, that's the 8-hour pulse release. That basically has no change from the no action alternative. So you see very little impact to the hydropower purpose in terms of the number of megawatt hours generated. There's still other impacts because the water's not always generated when it's of highest demand. So if you think about in the summertime, we'll talk about this on the next slide, when the water is more valuable, when people turn their air conditionings on, right? In the heat of the day, everything's working. That's where you'll still see some impacts. But in terms of generation, very little impact. Continuous flow, that's the 250 CFS around the clock. That one you see about a 7% difference in hydropower generation totals. So loss of potential power there. And then the seasonal, this is alternative 23, that's about half. That makes sense. We're looking at half the year doing 250, half the year not doing 250. All right, here is the graph that I told you earlier that was coming. So after we looked at kind of the year-round total of hydropower impacts and thinking about when the most critical time of the year is, not just for hydropower, but also for the environment, also for recreation, it really boils down to half of the year where we're looking at high temperatures, low dissolved oxygen, high power demands, high recreation time. It all happens at the same time of the year, right? Summer, fall time frame, people want to be out. People are also running their air conditioning. Temperatures are hot. Environment needs a lot of water. It also doesn't rain a lot. So we have a lot of things that are kind of competing and pulling us in different directions. This 250 CFS during this time of the year created about an 11% drop in hydropower. So again, those types of things impact the energy conglomerates that eventually get to your local energy dispatchers in terms of how your electric rates are changed, those types of things. That's where these kinds of numbers come in. It's a trickle-down effect. Obviously, we're talking high-level federal to local and eventually to you guys. That's how these work. Clarifying question?
How do you achieve the 11%?
That's probably more of a back there question. Sorry.
And can I ask, what's the current DO today?
Current dissolved oxygen? I'd have to look, but I can get back to you with that number. It's online, so I'll get one of my teammates to look it up. Gabe, can you look up the current DO at Centerhill? Thank you. It should be above 6. Okay, conclusions and TSP. So, after doing all this analysis, what did we basically come upon? We came upon, as a team, that the environmentally preferred alternative is alternative 17. So from an environmental perspective only, we're looking at which alternative is best for the environment. Alternative 17 was the 250 CFS 250 CFS continuous minimum flow from most likely the orifice gate all year round. Alternatives 17 and 23, they really provided similar benefits during that critical time, because obviously the 250 was working at that time of year. And the other time that we saw, there was a drop-off in benefits, but there was also a decrease in impacts to hydropower. So it kind of was a seasonal approach that did what we expected it to do. Alternative 4 did provide measurable environmental environmental benefits over the current operations. So looking at that and thinking, okay, this is what we had here, and this is what alternative 4 does, this is what alternative 17 does. Yes?
250 has to come from the orifice, it can't come from the generator, right?
Yeah, 250. So a hydropower turbine typically The number can range, but we estimate around 4,000 cubic feet per second from a hydropower turbine. Again, that could range from 3,500 to more than 4,000. 250 most likely would come from the orifice gate, yes. So based on this information, alternative 17 being environmentally preferred, alternative 17 and 23 being very similar environmentally during that season, alternative 4 providing a lot of benefits, but really mitigating a lot of the risk towards hydropower, towards increased cost, towards some of these things that we mentioned here on the bottom. Alternative 4 was selected as the Corps' tentatively selected plan because it provides that best balance of different project purposes. So it still provides water in the downstream area. It still provides additional flow over what's currently in the water control manual. Again, the current water control manual says 1 hour of hydropower generation every 48 hours. So we're changing from 1 hour 48 hours to 1 every 8 hours. It provides a lot of system-wide benefits. I mentioned before, the system is operated in tandem, right? Center Hill is one of those pieces that we have in the Cumberland River Basin. And having this come into play, it still balances all of the projects well across the basin. We still see those environmental improvements, like I said. It weighs those seasonal hydropower demands, and it takes into account changing climate, right? Thinking about how climate's going to change, how we're getting warmer continuously, how the rainfall is going to change. We're hearing it's going to get wetter. We don't know exactly, but we're hearing that wetness can come in different extremes, right? Higher during the wet season, lower during the dry season. So you might have more rain in February and less rain in August. That doesn't really help the situation because we're going to be evacuating that water out in February to make sure that we don't put the flood risk management in jeopardy there. And then this is the breakdown of that TSP. So what that means, again, minimum flow. 1 hydropower turbine comes online for 1 hour every 8 hours. That would be our new minimum flow if we went with our tentatively selected plan. Ramp rates, I didn't talk a ton about it, but again, so a ramp rate, when we're thinking about a hydropower turbine, we typically will bring, in the last 15 years, 1 unit on every hour. So time 0, no generation, we put a unit on, we wait an hour, then we bring the second unit on, wait an hour, then we bring the third unit on. The water control manual currently says we can do 2 units up or down an hour. We can either bring 2 units on an hour or take 2 units off an hour. So thinking about there, looking at public safety, thinking about when people are actually recreating, when we typically have the most risk. You think about people wading, think about people swimming and recreating in the river. Once that first hydropower turbine comes on and that 4,000 CFS is starting to flush, people typically move towards the banks and they get out. You hear the siren, you get out of the water, hopefully, and you continue on your day. You know, maybe you do some bank fishing, different things like that. You grab your boat, you can canoe down or kayak down, different things like that. Different opportunities, but no longer typically a safe condition to be in the river. Once that first hour is up, there's a lot less people and a lot less risk in that second hour. And so what we kind of have as our new ramp rate is 1 hydropower unit in the first hour, and then after that we could ramp up 2 units per hour. So we'll go from 0 units to 1 unit in the first hour, and then from 1 to potentially 3 in the second hour. On the way down, it's not really as much of a concern from a public safety standpoint. It's more of a concern for bank erosion, different things like that, where the bank will start falling into the river if you go down and discharge too quickly. And so for that, the water control manual already allows and has already analyzed 2 units down per hour. We're going to have that same criteria remain in effect for the way down. So being able to move from 3 units to 1 unit, or from 3 units to 2 units and 2 units to 0. Something like that is what we expect for this ramp rate. Sluice gates or orifice gate. Sluice gates typically is a very violent discharge. It comes up at 1,500 CFS. That's where you see that flip bucket and the water kind of sprays into the air. The orifice gate is about 250 CFS. That's a much smaller discharge. It's more of a trickle in terms of what you typically see at the face of the dam. Those Outlets will typically only be used for flood risk management purposes or when there's extreme cases when we need to utilize them for different environmental reasons. So on a normal basis, the plan would be to not utilize those other outlets very much. So that, in a nutshell, is the conclusion that we had, the different analysis that we went through, and the TSP we selected. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what this public comment period means in terms of the NEPA process, and then how we're going to proceed through the rest of the evening. So, again, this public comment period runs 30 days. You'll notice that the draft EA is dated 31 July. The notice went out on the 1st of August, so the comment period is going to go through the 1st of September. In order for your comments to be considered in the final environmental assessment, they need to be submitted by that date. So how to submit a comment? You can submit a comment card tonight. We've got a table over here that has comment cards and pens that you can fill out. You can also respond to that scoping letter via snail mail or email. What we'd like you to include is a substantive and relative comment. What we mean, or relevant comment. What we mean by that is that there are some things that are outside of the scope of this effort. So we talked a little bit about construction activities not being within the scope of this effort. So requests for something like a weir or diffusers or something like that is not really something that we can address in the document. So please focus comments on the NEPA process, on the evaluation of alternatives, and on the agency's tentatively selected plan. Please draft your own unique comment. We will address all of these comments in the final EA, but we are only going to count those comments once. So we will keep track of how many comments come in that say a certain thing, and we'll communicate that to our leadership. But in terms of text and actually answering questions, each individual comment will be answered one time. Please include your contact information. This helps us understand where y'all are coming from, where your interests are. All of that information is protected in the final document. We will publish the comments in the appendices of the document. If you've read the EA and looked at the appendices, you'll see that we have some sample comments in there, and all of the personally identifiable information is redacted. So please share that information. It helps add another data point for us to analyze, but just know that we won't be sharing that broadly. So for the rest of the night, we're going to take all verbal or informal questions back at the comment table. Those comments are not going to be recorded and addressed in the EA. Those are informational. If you'd like something to be considered in the EA, it should be written down. It should be submitted either tonight via comment card, sent in via snail mail, or emailed to us.
What email address? What is the email address?
It's this here. Sorry, it's a little bit unclear. We'll leave this up so y'all can come up and take a little closer look, but it's oh, sorry, yes. It's also on your pamphlet.
It's on the back of the pamphlet.
And that is a general comment inbox that we use in the planning office. Like I said, the review period ends September 1st. And all of those comments and all that feedback will be addressed in the final document. A clarifying question?
It's a clarifying question. I really think it's been skipped over.
Okay.
Why did you not do environmental impact statement, EIS? Because an EIS says major federal action that could significantly affect quality of human environment. Why did you not do an EIS? Because I think this is bigger impact on the human environment. Who made that decision to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that you're welcome to include in your public comment. The short answer to that is that significance is a big key word in NEPA. It has specific definitions, and the thresholds for significant impacts are very large. So a significant impact to hydropower, for example, might be bringing a system offline for an extended period of time. It may be...
Nowhere in here is it documented what.
In the environmental analysis section, there is a discussion of the degree of impact. There are also definitions at the beginning of the document of what we consider those thresholds to be. So this is a great example of a substantive comment. If you have a thought about our determination of impacts or our categorization of impacts, that's something you can write in and something we can consider in the final EA.
Clarifying question. I fish a lot of the different tail races, and correct me if I'm wrong, Center Hill does have the most fluctuation of probably any tail race river. Is that correct? As far as the low to the high, I mean, it can move 30 feet in February, like you said. You go out to the White River, that one may move 6 feet. Is that a correct statement, or is?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at each project.
Yeah, clear my question. Anthony, you said that in the model that the graphs were at a peak, or was it at the top? At what was stayed what it out?
Those are the lowest elevations between pulses. So the
So they were taken at the bottom of the 8 hours, or were they taken in the middle of the 8 hours? Or the top?
it's the bottom of the 8 hours. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, great question. And y'all can take a little bit closer look. Back at the recreation board is where we have all those cross sections laid out. Okay, so now I think we're going to go ahead and break. We're going to split up in the back. On the left, we have a NEPA table. This is for questions about the NEPA process. Definitions of significance would be great to pose there. If you want to take a look at the environmental assessment, we've got 2 printouts there. There's also QR codes in your handout with links that'll take you directly to the document. The next table is a recreation impacts table. That, again, talks a little bit about the surface area, the wetted perimeter, what you expect to see when you're on the river. The next over is the water management table. There you'll kind of see a little bit more of our day-to-day operations, the different things that we're balancing. There's some infographics about the different bands that we try to target. And then on the far right is a hydropower table that talks a little bit about this facility's contribution to the region's energy grid. So just while I've got you all captive, thank you so much for being here tonight. We really value the input from the public. I encourage you to take some time, read through the EA, email in questions if you have them. But please provide public comments. You know, this process is designed to involve the public in decision making, and we really want to hear from you. So again, thank you all from me and the rest of the team for being here, and we'll look forward to continuing those conversations in the back of the room.